box. And with that, I'll hand over to our wonderful panel and Dr. K.
Thank you. Very good evening, all of you. Let me first thank Abha and Arkaja for that very crisp and focused presentation. It's also my privilege to thank Yamini for her welcome remarks and setting the context for this KYR or Know Your Regulator series. I'm very happy to be having this conversation with Dr. Sahu and Dr. Mekhala Krishnamurthy. Let me start with a question for Dr. Sahu. Perhaps among the easily, from what I recall, perhaps the most experienced regulatory mind available sort of here. My top of the sort of head recall is Dr. Sahu. Besides your many years in the Ministry of Finance, directly dealing with policy and issues relating to regulation, including, for instance, the drafting of the entire depositories legislation, you have actually worked in a stock exchange, which is a frontline regulator. You've been member of the SEBI, the Securities Exchange Board of India. You've been a member of the Competition Commission of India, which is a regulator, which is also a very heavily quasi-judicial body. You've been the CEO of the Institute of Company Secretaries of India, a regulator of a profession. You are, of course, now the first chairperson of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Given your experience in the sector in India, what would be your explanation for the sort of the explosion, if I may use that word, in the number of what Abha called SRAs, the statutory regulatory agency or statutory regulatory authorities numbers in India? I sort of again quickly calculating in my mind, I can think of probably between 10 to 15 statutory regulators at the level of the union government and perhaps an equal number at the state levels. So what would be the explanation for this huge increase in the number of this new form of organization of government, something that you've called in your writings a mini state or a neo state? So I'd be happy to get your thoughts on this.
I think in the decade beginning 90s, we had a major economic reforms, what we call liberalization, privatization, and globalization. That means we then started giving economic freedom to market participants or economic agents. I just would like to give one figure. From 1900 to 1947, when we did not have any freedom, growth rate was under 1%. From 47 to 92, when we got only civil freedom, growth rate tripled. We had the Hindu growth rate of 3.5%. From 92 to 2021, except for the recent COVID event, the growth rate has been on average 7%, and it is essentially because of economic freedom. So now we have tested the benefits of freedom. There are several empirical studies relating the economic freedom with economic gains or gross domestic product. So once we have tested the benefits of liberalization and gains from freedom, we are embracing the institutions required to make that freedom work. We made an experiment in the early 90s, 1992 precisely. In fact, the entire reforms I look at in 3 phases, because there are regulators also. If you look at typologies of regulators, that has links with this kind of reforms. In the first stage, we liberalized the laws relating to, say, Capital Issues Control Act, Industrial Development Regulations Act, Export-Import Control Act. Those were the legislations which had as a part of its name word control. We actually wanted to move away from control to regulation. As Akhtar was mentioning, that licensing, actually that is the time we abandon the idea of licensing. That's something bad word, that's a part of the control regime. We moved to a regime called registration. That means we pre-specify these are the requirements for doing business or rendering service. Anybody and everybody who meets those requirements is entitled to get registration, and the authorities have no way to deny it. And if they do it, they have to do the regency order, and that is appellable. So that is the kind of freedom we gave, that people have freedom to start a business. That essentially happened by the IDRA amendment, capital laws amendment, when we came up with the idea that we actually repealed that Control Capital Issues Control Act. And because to start a business, you need resources. So we told that henceforth you go and raise money on the terms you want. It's up to you, make disclosures. We moved from merit-based regulation to disclosure-based regulations. That was the beginning, early 90s. Having made some progress in freedom of entry, then many people have come in. We had another law called Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, which did not allow you to do business beyond a scale. So monopoly or a dominant position was considered bad, but by 2000 we realized that it is not necessarily bad. If there are abuses, those can be managed, regulated, but let us promote competition, and if monopoly is giving benefit, let's take those economic benefit. Because there are cases we talk about natural monopolies, there are certain things where we get more benefit by having monopoly. So then we jumped to Monopolies Restrictive Trade Practices Act, came up with Competition Act. That is 2000. It took some time for implementation, but that was the time where we gave freedom to the people to compete at marketplace. But simultaneously, we ensure that I have freedom to do business, but I do not have freedom to come on your way. So that explains also the rationale for regulation. Like in our civil freedom, I have the freedom to move my hands, but I cannot move in a way which obstructs your movement. So that is what was done in the decade beginning of 2000. People had freedom to continue business. After they have done the business, the decade beginning of 2000 is happened in 2014-15. Somebody is not able to compete, either failing on account of competition for endogenous reasons, exogenous reasons, innovation, maybe because of the COVID. So then we need a way that the entrepreneur, as well as the resources which are underutilized, unutilized, they should be released for alternate uses. That is where we came up with the freedom to exit, which we call the ultimate freedom or freedom from failure. So this set of reforms actually is one category of regulators. It's brought up one category of regulators. These are resource allocation regulators. So the securities laws, corporate, the competition law and the insolvency law, these are non-sectoral because these ensure the right allocation of resources. We have other kinds of regulators where we looked at the reforms in one area. So the point I was making that because we gave freedom to people, this freedom must not be misused. And freedom is misused, it is likely to create market failures. Those three standard regimes of market failures. If you have freedom, it's likely to be abused. So we do not want in a marketplace those to be abused. People should have real freedom and not disturb others' freedom. And because of this, we got the huge benefits I told you in terms of growth. And that encouraged everyone, let us set up a regulator, give them the responsibility and empower with the, actually the process has taken quite some time from 92 till now. The process is still maturing, establishing process. There are, you have different regimes, different administrative ministries experimenting, but there is a general understanding that if you pass on something to regulator in a predefined framework, the outcome has been better. But then look at also the political part of it. The why the regulators are coming up, because it's a very interesting question, what politicians or government expects. Government wants that the decisions of regulators should be insulated from the whims or the pressures of the political groups. In the interest of the nation, there should be stability of the regime. So politicians should not destroy that. So even politicians also want them to be insulated by the unpopular decisions of the regulators. So that is why government is finding also, if things are working, let us pass on the responsibility, but provide a framework, more so when I am a market player. So government till then Even till recently, in some areas, government is the market player and referee simultaneously. So these are the reasons which prompted growth of regulators.
Thank you. It's actually a nice way of classifying, what you call the resource allocator agencies. So in a sense, it's entry, ease, and exit that these three regulators deal with. Maybe Mekhla wants to come in here. I have a few questions, but I'll come back to them later.
No, that was a really wonderful framing to start. When you mentioned economic freedom and including all the way to the exit freedom from failure, but we also know that many economic sectors in India have structural asymmetries and inequalities, particularly when you think about producers and consumers and the way in which markets are structured. Arpita also mentioned in her, in the presentation, this very important role of promotion. So often the acts also have these terms promotion and regulation, right? But that's a different, they're slightly different functions to promote and shape a market, which might be asymmetric, versus sort of regulating market fair practice, which begins, as you said, must begin with an idea of trust, right? That enterprise should be encouraged. So this challenge of balancing promotion and regulation, similarly, there is a very big difference between development work and often, but there is a very core role for development and the state's role in developing certain sectors, and then in regulation. So I think both promotion and regulation, development and regulation go together, but they're quite distinct. And yet in the framing of our agencies and in understanding regulatory purpose, I think sometimes they're conflated, and we see the challenges that come both in terms of the public's expectation and political expectation about what is the public purpose of regulation, which is easy when we think about development, but much more complex when it comes to regulation.
So let me start with your last question. See, what is a regulator is not defined anywhere. You do not have any agency which has regulator as a name or a surname. You have commissions, boards, authorities. That means that there is no agency which does not do some amount of regulation, and there is no agency which does only regulation. Those who call regulators, let's say IBBI, it's not that they are doing only regulation, they are doing also something else. Maybe predominantly they are doing regulation. I put it that in the space earmarked for a so-called regulator, that regulator is almost in 80-90% of cases monopolist. The IBBI is a monopolist in the regulation of this area. But the developmental work, what IBBI does, IBBI is not a monopolist. So in developmental space, most of the regulators have some developmental role. If you look at the SEBI Act, which is SEBI, I consider the most evolved regulator and the senior most regulator in 92. So that reads their preamble, their long title to the act reads, it is to protect the interests of investment securities and promote development of and to regulate. So they don't say to develop, they say they promote the development of. So in 92, when we started the reforms, the debate came up whether what do you regulate if there's no market? But how does the market develop if it does not have the comfort of a regulation? So development and regulation have to go hand in hand, particularly if you are doing the initial reforms, starting from the scratch, from the beginning, you have to develop something. Then only you can regulate. I will give an example. In 96, securities law was amended to say that securities include derivatives. Then people thought once we include there, the market in derivatives would develop. It did not develop. It required a specific regulatory framework which came in 1999, then it happened. So that means a product like derivative which is existing elsewhere, we are just copying it here. It needs a regulatory framework first, then product will happen. Recently in insolvency space, we came up with a regulatory framework for pre-packaged insolvency resolution process. This exists in UK. This exists without any statutes by market practices are developed. But once it is developed somewhere else, at other place, people ask, first give me a framework, then I will start. But the derivative, when it started for the first time in 1969-70, it did not start with regulation. Fast development happens. So now we are in a situation that development and regulation, at least in the initial 20, 30, 40 years of reforms, every regulator will have some element of development. But development does not mean that development can mean just promote the development, can mean that you provide a proper regulatory framework, make it fair, simple, trustworthy, people will come and do the transaction. Other is regulator can say that I myself will be a market player. So, or at least I will give some incentive so that people come here and do the business. That means actually if you are talking about securities regulator or any of these regulators, if you are looking at the resource allocation should be the most efficient, then you cannot be supporting A at the cost of B. Every policy has to be neutral. So there are instances where regulators have preferred to be non-neutral, and that arises only in these cases. In case of sectoral regulators, the general regulators, they don't do it. That is why at times we have a tussle between sectoral regulator and general regulator. And sometimes let's say competition. Some sectoral regulators say that competition is my domain, I want to handle competition in my area. But general regulators say that no, this is our area. But then there is a law says that let's say there is cooperation, but it does not work well. So this was, I think, your second and third question. The first question was about the structural asymmetry. I think the job of the regulation is not to disturb the competition. Actually, it is rather to buttress the competition further, not to replace the competitive forces of market. What happens in certain sectors like utilities? Okay, this is another typology of a regulator that there are three broad types of regulators or three broad spaces. One is the regulation of professions, company secretary, chartered accountants, medical science, insolvency professional. This is one category. The second category is of the markets, the SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA, IBBI, and third category is the utilities, the TRAI, petroleum, PNGRB, ERA. So it is difficult to have competition in these utility sectors. We have made some progress in electricity, but that is the last thing that comes in any country also, because you cannot have a competition because of the indivisible. Those are the economic characteristics. You cannot have many players. You cannot have that easy entry, that easy exit. That's why in utilities, we do not have, there are structural problems. But the stock market is the best example, or what in economics, we have the perfect competition. The stock market is, if you can think of a perfect anywhere, the stock market is the closest to that, or at least that is the best one can have. That means where simultaneously you have millions of people willing to buy and sell, and trades happen within milliseconds. So that nobody has any control over the price. But in utility regulations, we have not been able to go beyond that as of now. So that is why we have structural issues somewhere in the utility segment, but not in other segments. In other segments, if it is there, it is our inefficiency. Those can be addressed.
The sort of, you touched upon the evolution of regulatory agencies in India. Excuse me. Prior to that, in their presentation, Abha and Arkaja had spoken about the characteristics, some of the standard characteristics of regulatory agency in terms of design principles, arm's length, etc., etc. I want to go to sort of one characteristic that we see in a lot of regulators in India, starting with the regulator that you mentioned, the most evolved 1992 created SEBI. The fundamental principle that sort of one has grown up with in the constitutional scheme of things of separation of powers and checks and balances, we seem to have explicitly moved away from this in fusing three very major functions in one body, namely the power to effectively legislate. Because a lot of these legislations are bare bones legislation, which say that on A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and an omnibus ejusdem generis type clause, any other matter related to A to E above, the board or the body may regulate by regulations. So effectively, creation of legislation. The agency is also the executor or implementer of the regulations typically that it makes. And in many cases, it also happens to become the agency which will adjudicate or very loosely speaking, be the judge in disputes arising between itself and an entity in the market which is supposed to follow the legislations that this body created. In other words, the Trimurti, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, creation of legislation, enforcer of the legislation, as well as the agency which will take note of violations and arbitrate, so to say. So is that a necessity? Because one doesn't see necessarily the same design in many countries. And is it necessary? And if so, are there adequate checks and balances to ensure that this is not something which becomes an agency with too much concentration of power?
Yeah, that's right. That has been a concern for quite some time, but the effort has been to balance. This is a structure we created in response to the dynamic markets. In fact, I recall one statement of Mr. C.B. Bhabe. He used to give an example that the job of a regulator is to kind of hitting a moving target. His example that you are flying an aircraft at 30,000 feet high that has developed a snag. You can't too late to come down or too risky to continue flying. So you have to repair then and there. So that is the situation in a stock market or any market situation we are dealing. So dynamic is so fluid, it cannot wait for the previous regime where, previous regime means this standard state regime, where we have something called complete law, almost complete law. We moved from almost complete law to almost incomplete law. The example of complete law is just Indian Penal Code. That was written in 1861. It's serving well. The definition of theft is serving us 150 years. It has not even undergone one amendment. So perfectly written. That also something to give credit to the quality of people who are doing the drafting then. But those are the things more of a static kind of things for which we created that legislature has made the law. Executive or police will go and find out the culprit, then judicial will hang him. And if there's any problem, then again you come back to parliament, which will take a year, 3 years, 5 years to make a new law. Till that time, you become a little, you cannot do anything. But in market situations, if you do that, actually the whole purpose of giving freedom is lost. You wanted everyone should come and do the business. All that we are talking about, ease of doing business, including society, not to restrict the ability of the people. But if you say that no, something cannot be done, let's say market has come up with a product and that you cannot allow, and you want to go to parliament 5 years, 3 years, then you are actually losing the benefits. So that is why in response to dynamic market, when you give freedom, two things came up. One is a regulator and one is a subordinate legislation or regulation. So we moved to a skeleton type of parliamentary legislation, then enable the people to make the details of regulations, but in sync with the market developments. There are possibilities of, though again in our constitution does not talk about actually separation of powers or strict separation of powers, though it envisages, and there is some separation, but we do not have 100% separation also. Actually, we have a district magistrate, he does also all kinds of things. So everybody has some element, but there is separation is desirable. We have a separation, but it's not a very strict mandate. But if we are getting somewhere benefits, so we should address the concerns of keeping all these things together. And there are many standard techniques have come up. One thing which is IBBI has done is that we have divided, and that is what Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission and the current thinking about the regulatory architecture is coming out. Recently, there is a report on the Competition Law Review Committee that has gone one step further. And there's a committee on the valuation of profession. Or if you look at the national medical profession, they have gone a little further. But we are moving on that direction. So at IBBI, we have created 3 separate wings. Legislative wing, executive wing, judicial wing. We have different names. We call legislative is the research and regulation, and registration, research, and so we have 3 wings with the 3 different whole-time members. And there's a kind of, we have all will have an organizational bias, but still the person who has done the investigation or found somebody guilty, he will not decide what will be the fate of it. So somebody else will be there. That means we want some procedural sanctity to ensure that the bias of one person does not seep into another person. We should have also accountability, strong accountability arrangements, like the regulator has all 3 functions, but all 3 must be subject to scrutiny, which is not happening today the way it should happen. But for the 2 actions, the judicial, quasi-judicial action and legislative action, the parliament has retained the power itself, in the sense every quasi-legislative action, every regulation made by the regulator shall be placed before parliament for certain days, and parliament is supposed to scrutinize. There is a committee on subordinate legislation, and every quasi-judicial action nowadays there are dedicated tribunals to scrutinize that. So these 2 activities you have, and those are tribunal means it has to be a professional tribunal now, because this is operating in the area of a professional quality or caliber. So there are you should have checks and balances, but not lose the benefits of having all 3 powers with one agency. So clearly there are benefits, but we must harness the benefits, manage the concerns.
One thought about benefits and concerns is also, as you think, that a lot of regulation has to be done very dynamically, right? And on the fly. You give the metaphor of on the fly, and you have to be able to respond. Now, certainly, as you say, you don't have long time periods. You have to make quick decisions. There are benefits. There are also risks. So in certain areas, particularly now when we think about, in this COVID context, we've been talking a lot about drugs and vaccines. There is, complex questions which we'll get into in future discussions on food safety and those kinds of technical questions. Then there are challenges around technology regulation, where there is a very healthy and important debate. So the ability and therefore not over determining in legislation actually means that the regulatory agency has to have much greater depth of capacity in order to be able to take up these questions. And so as we move into thinking about individual regulators and regulatory capacity questions, precisely if you have to be able to make these judgment calls quickly and be very responsive, but these are technically complex and there are risks involved. How does one build it into the regulatory design? And I think in the course of the series, we will look at this question with individual regulators, speak to them about how they have addressed this problem. But as a general challenge, or a very specialized form of administration, which is so critical, how would we address this and approach this?
No, every regulator has 2 broad kinds of work. One is doing the legislation, doing the disciplinary action, and following certain procedure, irrespective of the kind of business you deal. The other is the subject knowledge. If you are a securities market regulator, you must have knowledge of the securities market. But irrespective of the security market knowledge, you need also some knowledge about the regulation making, enforcement, adjudication. So both the knowledges are required. But you have to start somewhere. I got the criticism when insolvency law came in 2016. IBBI was set up on 1st October, and I was told that the transactions must commence on 1st December, 60 days time. Within this 60 days time, you have to create insolvency professional agencies, information utility, write all the regulations about processes, corporate insolvency, voluntary liquidation, all those things, and then process will start. So this was instruction, do it by this time. But another set of people told that until you have the world-class insolvency professionals who can handle the most complicated cases, why do you start these reforms? So how do you learn swimming unless you go to the swimming pool? So you have to start somewhere. I always give the example that, so for the first time when we came across the disease cancer, we didn't wait for the oncologist to arrive on the scene and do the treatment. We told the general physicians and medical specialists, they did the treatment. Whatever they learned, they codified that became a field of knowledge, oncology, and that further, after some time, people studied it, became further branches, further specialization. So you have to start somewhere. We could not have told in 92 that we don't have any capacity, we will not create SEBI. But once SEBI is created, we have to look at whether we are developing capacity. People, we have knowledge about the market part. So people, we have many experts on securities law, many experts on, let's say, petroleum and natural gas, many experts we have, but we have not really developed the capacity on the regulatory work as such, which is overarching kind of thing. And that is where actually these academies can play a role. And today we do not have insolvency professional we started with something we started, but today we have Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs runs, National Institute of Bhopal runs a 2-year graduate insolvency program, on completion of which one can become an insolvency professional. So similarly, since it was a very limited area for IBBI, so we thought, let us sponsor this. We took leadership and did it. But when we talk about regulatory capacity, it becomes a public good. Every regulator should do it. But that means there's a business opportunity for academies to come up with the courses to build the capacity. We do not have a course. I have spoken earlier to Dr. Krishnan also. We don't have a course on how to do inspection and investigation. Every market regulator try to learn from an income tax officer, who try to learn from a police inspector. So criminal investigation is being used in these civil matters. So there has to be an effort, conscious effort. The academies should come up with the programs which prepares, which builds capacity of regulators.
Point well taken, but this capacity issue, I recall, I'm sure so do you, when the FSLRC gave its report, the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, one recommendation, not really a part of the FSLRC report, but I think in one of the accompanying documents was, since there was a suggestion to create a couple of new agencies, for instance, the Securities Appellate Tribunal was to become a financial services appellate tribunal, because the jurisdiction was going to widen, not merely the securities market, but presumably insurance and pensions. So it was, in a sense, the transformation of this agency from a limited area to a much wider area. And the approach then taken was create a task force, anticipate a lot of what is required, do the preparation that is required, because once an agency gets created, the public expectations are absolutely good quality delivery from day one. Let's go back to the example that you gave. India slept, in a sense, from 1999-2000, when we started dealing with this question of stressed assets, if not earlier, the Sikh Industries Undertaking Act, etc., etc. So we have a long history of struggling with the problem of businesses failing and how to provide them exit. Suddenly, there is political momentum. There is a budget announcement in 2014. We have a body which then drafts a law. Government enacts it. Once enacted, in the next 1 month, we want child delivery. Now, this is a problem of, I think, the political expectation that we somehow need to figure out how to manage. Namely, we will sleep on issues for 20 years, but when we decide to act, We want outcomes tomorrow morning. And these kinds of capacities are not easy to build. And I'm sure you are getting similar feedback. Insolvency professional is not a capacity which can get built up in one classroom in 8 months. It requires expertise. So any thoughts on how can one convince Parliament and government on the need to sort of quote unquote hasten slowly? Clearly, politics will want outcomes tomorrow morning, but you may be actually being counterproductive by putting the cart before the horse, creating an agency, increasing expectations, and then staring at the possibility of very suboptimal outcomes. Any thoughts? I've not said anything new. I mean, these are problems you and I have lived with. Any possible suggestions on how do we get buy-in for this capacity building
difficult actually. See, there are certain things which we are doing for the first time, but many things we are doing it in different ways. So in the security market, SEBI we brought in, but we had some capacity over 150 years of managing, regulating stock market. And we took a decision, now we will operate at a slightly higher level. But so insolvency was a completely new thing.
Brand new field.
And like SAT example, an organization is existing. So when SAT or the security market, they were working actually. That means you can do marginal reforms. Is it possible to do marginal reforms? You continue running SAT, but simultaneously run a project. And that project matures. Whatever you want to plan 1 year, 2 year, you want to have a technology system, you want to train the people, do that, then bring it and place it after 2 years here while this is running. But in case of insolvency, that's why I gave the example, unless people do the transactions, they will never learn. You have to start it somewhere. Yes, those are the political considerations. So there can be, actually, I think that every idea has a time. This depository legislation was going on since 81. And in my finance ministry, nothing was happening, but all of a sudden someone decided that it will happen. It happened in 1 month's time in September 95. But if we, at that time or even insolvency, it says we can plan and get a better outcome. But if you do not join when there is an idea, there is a willingness to do this, we may end up not having anything at all.
Yeah.
So that means most of us, we cannot make it happen, but somebody is giving a clue can happen, and if we join, it will happen. But if we want the best condition to happen, it will never happen. And that is in any democratic system, we have these issues, and it's not only the country or political, even this is, that's why I gave the example of the academies. So this is the entire ecosystem has problem, and ecosystem does not produce quality.
I actually wonder if I may ask a question to both of you, drawing on your experiences in administration. I think the presentation also brought out that, it's a very specialized field of administration. So I'm just trying to think about regulation in the field of public administration. We draw a lot on former civil servants, bureaucrats, former judges to staff many of the regulatory authorities. But also, Dr. Krishnan, I remember one of our first conversations was about your experience managing and running a grain market or a mandi, an agricultural produce market, which was as a civil servant was one of the charges that you held. So there will be certain regulatory role that bureaucrats and civil servants also play. And you mentioned district magistrates, so there's a mix. And then, of course, there are specialized regulators who draw both on the bureaucracy as well as on judges, and then there's professionals. And, it also brings us to this Know Your Regulator talks. We were discussing the title. And so is it Know Your Regulatory Agency or Know Your Regulator? Like Dr. Sahu, you're a regulator as a human being. So it's both individuals and institutions. The regulator is both the authority, and as you said, there's nobody, it's called a regulator. There are commissions or authorities, or could be a department. And then there are regulatory agents and officers and public servants who are regulators. So, both reflecting on this challenge of, the relationship between like the regulatory bureaucracy and bureaucracy at large, administration, public administration, from your own personal experiences, having interacted and played both roles and been in these, been working closely in these different capacities. And then, a little bit of personal reflection on the qualities of regulation, the disposition that's required, particularly both for frontline and senior regulators, the kinds of people you have to become, the professional identity of being a regulator, the kinds of ways in which discretion, cultivating that sense of neutrality, of understanding public purpose. Because while all of this is very important, I think the question of professional capacity and the ecosystem is so important, it also comes down to individuals. And maybe drawing on your own experiences of individual regulators who you have seen and been inspired by or thought that this is in. So.
Question to both, sir.
Yeah, sure. You want to, since you're the actual regulator and I've only been the government side, quote unquote, handling regulation, maybe I'll let you start.
Okay. So you talked about the manning the regulators and that bureaucrats getting appointed to regulators. So actually, again, you have to start somewhere. But it's an impression that regulatory bodies are manned by the routine bureaucrats. It's not right, actually, in the sense, yes, regular people are appointed by government to be chairman members of those regulatory bodies. Let's say SEBI's chairman and members, 4 or 5 people are appointed by the government. But SEBI has its own cadre, which is about 1,000 plus now, and some people from that cadre have already become members. So the capacity development is happening within that organization. Government, since it has set up, it only appoints the top people. So it's not that the people who are going to regulatory bodies, since if they do not have ability, the organization does not have ability. It's organized. Again, you have to allow for some time. SEBI has come up. Say IBBI today, we are managing with mostly deputationists, but we have maybe 50% deputationists from the regulatory bodies, SEBI, RBI, those kinds of people. So that is one aspect. The second is, it is a regulator or government bureaucracy or politician or even CPR, any academic institution, you are living in the society. You are willy-nilly bringing the culture from the society to this place. You cannot probably much different from the kind of people we have around. So subject to that, I think one can make islands, but island will not be very substantially different from the outside.
So just to supplement, I think the HR or the human resource personnel issues in regulators are, I think, now a serious issue, because agreeing with what Dr. Sahu said, clearly SEBI today, after 20 years, has a large cadre of its own. That has led to a whole set of new issues that we need to deal with. Like in any organization, there are serious aspirations of the person who joined as a straight from college, law graduate, chartered accountant, MBA in SEBI. She also would like one day to be member, chairperson. Very often, when you speak to ministers, the Standing Committee of Parliament, which deals with SEBI, and I'm now reflecting on actual conversations with people in these kinds of bodies, there is also this view that Chairman SEBI or Governor RBI or Chairman IBBI is not merely a narrow subject matter, quote unquote, regulator, but exactly the point that Sahu Saab made in a different context. You are part of a much larger ecosystem. So the RBI at one level may be a banking regulator, but the head of that regulator is not a narrow technical banking regulator, but looking at implications of that regulation for society. It has implications for politics. Governments can come down if you drastically reclassify, let's say, an NPA norm. It may be technically very desirable, but can the polity actually stomach it? Can it handle it? So at the higher levels in these agencies, the skill sets that are required are not only narrow knowledge of subject matter, but polity, constitution, economics, international principles. So this difficult tension of how much do you allow organizational people to reach the top? What is the right balance of the insider outsider mix, etc., are going to be complicated questions. Plus, I think there is a set of skills that are cross-cutting. There is a certain basic notion now of what constitutes regulation. It is principles of law, Constitution of India, economics. If it's an economic sector regulator, it could be some other domain where it may be electricity or airports or some other utility, RERA, where you require some domain knowledge.
Food, drugs.
Yeah. So
health.
there is clearly a set of some skill sets that will perhaps apply across regulators. So is there scope for a SEBI regulator moving to Competition Commission, moving to banking, moving to Food Safety Standards Authority of India, moving to IBBI? So I think now, 30 years after our first statutory regulator in the post-independence era, there is, I think, now a set of questions that are very different from the questions that we looked at in 1992. And I think the HR questions of regulators are going to become very critical, because that will make or mar the regulator. On your specific question of personal, clearly, one of the wisest regulators that I can think of recent times is our former boss, Dr. Subbarao. Not a trained regulator. He was, in one sense, a classic civil servant who had done a variety of jobs: state finance, Government of India finance, international finance in the World Bank. Not a trained lawyer. Ordinarily, you would worry about, because these regulators are very strongly rooted in law, because they're created by statute. And I think unless you have a good understanding of constitution, rule of law, principles of this nature, it's not easy to do regulation. But I think a lot of people with experience, wisdom, and public life grow into these jobs very quickly. And I think that's the point that Dr. Sahu made. I'm sure, if I recall right, Mr. Bhave is not a trained lawyer.
Yeah.
Formally, but instinctively understood constitutional rule of law, because the 30 years, 25 years of prior life, equivalent of Purvashrama, before somebody becomes a sannyasi, your Purvashrama clearly influences your current role. I think some of these have been extremely good regulators, Dr. Subbarao, Mr. Bhave, coming from their own experience of government, where audi alteram partem, nobody is condemned unheard, or you are not a judge in your own cause. These are all principles of natural justice, which are, I think, ingrained in most civil servants. These have been, I think, wonderful examples of people who evolved into absolutely first-rate regulators.
I think one of the exciting things about this series is that we will hear from regulators who are currently serving about their challenges and make them visible, because in some cases we hear a lot about certain regulators, but many other very complex areas of regulation and regulatory institutions, we don't hear so much. And it will be very, interesting to hear about how they grew into their roles, what they think some of the critical challenges that they have faced, how they learned, because you have to, as you say, learn, and you have to do these things before you're necessarily ready, to do them. But I wanted to, take a little forward this idea of know your regulator to the public. One of the things in our early conversations was that, and the title of this session is why should you know your regulator, right? And we've talked a lot about the challenges of regulatory capacity, but some reflections of how you think regulators are perceived by the public, the different ways in which, whatever, the public is a very diverse entity, of course, thinks about regulators, how regulators are covered. How do you come to discover your regulator? You may, of course, as you say, when you have to go for registration or license, take a license, or, in that course of actually being an actor who is being regulated, those are your closest relationships. But when you think about the public, why, in your sense, like, how do you think they view regulators? Why is it important that we increase the amount of engagement? Again, when we talk about civil servants, we talk a lot about the citizen state engagement. In development, we talk a lot about accountability, the exchange between the public, whereas regulation is a different category of administration. So, why is it so important? And in some ways, your own ideas or hopes for this kind of series, or this way of thinking about public engagement between regulators and diverse groups who are all stakeholders in regulation and regulatory life?
See, with time, the governance, economic governance and economic matters have shifted from government to these regulatory bodies. We are talking about ease of doing business because business is contributing to our growth or prosperity, everything. And if the regulators are looking after those, they have the oversight mechanism over that. So the stakeholders must know how the regulators are performing. There are perception issues actually. Actually, quite a bit of regulators are perception issues. Say, for example, actually, again, from my SEBI background, in the early 90s, when G.V. Ramakrishna was the chairman, if something SEBI was doing, then people used to come to North Block. Then from there, something goes to SEBI, that was Mittal Court. So he used to say to those regulated people that the way from, because the people were located actually in Fort area in Bombay. So the way from Fort to Mittal Court is not via North Block. So it all depends on how much of this kind of perception we allow to continue for long. If somebody is able to reach government and government gives a message and do this, then people think, okay, regulators are of no use. Actually, anything I can get it done from the government. We have experience of, even today also, the regulator passes some order. If a judge passes an order, people don't utter a word, they go on appeal if they are unhappy. But if a regulator passes a very strong order against a big party, then you find a newspaper, what is that called, something advertorial or advertisements, a full page advertisement saying that this regulator does not understand anything. So this is what actually many people try to create a misunderstanding about the regulator, and they do not want regulators really to stand up and grow, because they think that, I think that is my understanding, that they think that regulator is probably in a better place or has better capability to catch your conduct. So it's better course is that we do not allow the regulator to work. The second is that it's like 7 blind men trying to touching the elephant and trying to describe this is the elephant. So different people look at different aspects of the regulator. In insolvency law, which deeply affected the rights and interests of people, those who have lost, they will definitely not say that this is a good reform is going on, the regulator is doing a good work. Those who gained also, they will look at only their aspect, they will not take a totality view. So today we have the criticism that so many companies are going into liquidation. But is that problem with insolvency law, problem somewhere else? But there are interest groups who would like to project this as a problem and then undo these reforms. So what can be done is that, also again my security market experience, if the stock market goes up, many people believe that the SEBI has done an outstanding job. But if it comes down also, people believe that SEBI is not doing a good job. So what is happening is that people are trying to judge these regulators on some yardstick which is readily available. So exchange, the index, scientifically constructed, well maintained, regularly available. Let's use that. In insolvency, the figure regularly comes out what is the percentage of a recovery. But this recovery percentage in insolvency or a Sensex in stock market, they do not tell anything about either stock market or the insolvency performance. But because those are available regularly, people tend to use that in the absence of proper yardstick. The regulators have to actually develop proper yardstick, make it available. So then people will judge what regulators are doing. Sir.
Yeah, in fact, I want to take that example that he gave of reaching Mittal Court via North Block. Since some of the the persons that I'm going to talk about are all the event is very proximate. I will not name names. You remember the Rupal Ben Panchal scam? This is that multiple demat account scam. Scamster just took photographs, created depository accounts, and got allocations done. In a booming market, everybody is trying to get a part of the small IPO allocations available to the retail public. And this is a scam which broke out, and then the SEBI very quickly passed a very elaborate order going into individual cases and undoing a lot of these old, the new fraudulent accounts. But it was multiple IPOs and tens of thousands of accounts. So clearly, in the time that was available, it wasn't possible to do 100% due diligence. There were some mistakes in that order. So one very senior cabinet minister walked across to North Block with the order pointing out, look, some page X, paragraph Y, factually wrong. Kindly do something. And the relevant minister took the paper, and in the presence of the finance secretary, I and a couple of others, I don't know if Mr. Sahu was present, he was, we were all colleagues in the Ministry of Finance. The petition was torn and thrown into the dustbin with exactly the answer that you gave. If this was the order of a high court, would you have dared come and given a petition to government? The recourse lies in Securities Appellate Tribunal. But this kind of enlightenment doesn't actually exist everywhere. So I think we need to draw attention to this very sui generis category of public agency called regulator. And it is not, it's a new form of government. It's a new form of organization. But I want to just draw your attention to two small things. The movement away from a producer state to a regulator state means we'll have a proliferation of these agencies. So we are familiar with what is to be done when the district magistrate says no to my caste certificate application or age certificate. I do not know the answer very often to what happens when a bank says no to my KYC application. I feel helpless. So, we need to educate because regulators are going to touch our lives very regularly. Two, with services becoming a dominant part of the GDP, consumer protection issues in India will be, very dominant parts of our daily lives. Real estate, telecom, finance. Now, these are all now the dominant parts of India's growth story. And these are all sectors which are riddled with consumer protection issues for economic reasons that, for want of time, one can't go into, but they are intuitively obvious. And
you and I, them in each session.
Yeah, and you and I deal with mobile phones, security markets, banking, insurance, where we keep coming up with please call 1-800 and you run into difficulty. So you don't know what to do. So I think knowing your regulator is also intended to throw light on what is to be done when you're frustrated with bank X, where you can't get your address changed. You've got every document or so-and-so depository account where you run into difficulties. I'm giving examples from the financial sector because these immediately relate to us. But IBBI, when it started dealing with home buyers, it was dealing with, in a sense, the population on the street. FSSAI, which is going to be the first full conversation that we will have with regulators on October 21st at about this time, is perhaps an agency that now touches more lives than any public agency in India. That kurkure that you eat, that small packet of biscuit that you open, everything that we deal with probably 25, 30 times on a day is directly regulated by FSSAI for the consumer, for the producer, for the intermediary. So regulators touch our lives far more than we realize. So I think it's important for the citizen, for her to know who is the regulator, what does she do, and what is my recourse. Consumer protection came up, in the presentations of Arkaja and Abha as one of the main reasons for a regulator. And for a lot of regulators, that is, I think, the reason why we need to know the regulator.
No, this is great. We'll move to a few questions from the audience. We have both from Facebook and from Zoom. So from Facebook, there's, thank you to all of you for this wonderful session. What are your views on parliamentary oversight of regulators? So that's one question. I'll put them out and then you can take them because that will be more time efficient. So that's the first. The second, there's a question from Priya Singh on, looking at regulation in the social sectors. And she's sort of drawing on this distinction and the relationship we were drawing between development and regulation. And she's interested about regulation for social services, such as education, with the very different kinds of organizations. Is this a different kind of regulation? What does the body regulate? And again, we will look at some of this in more detail when we look at the sectors, but for now, your views on that. And then a final question, I'll put three for you to begin with, from a colleague, Deepak Sanan, who says, what are the challenges of being a regulator in India today? This would probably be good as a final response as well. In essence, how are they different from the challenges faced by civil servants in their role and other public servants in their role? And it'll be interesting for you to think about both senior regulators, but also the regulatory front lines in this. I mean, I'm reminded, in the Mandi inspectors knew the purpose of regulation, right? But they had a very particular understanding of the public purpose of it. So just to think about what are the challenges of being a regulator in India today and the differences between, regulation and other civil servants. So these three.
So challenges of being a regulator, perhaps he's best placed to answer. Let me very quickly talk about parliamentary oversight. I think it's a serious concern. Dr. Sahu did mention when we spoke about accountability that for each function, legislative, executive, and quasi-judicial, there are recourses prescribed in the legislation, the mother legislation itself. For instance, all regulations made by a regulatory agency post facto have to be placed before Parliament. Parliament has the right to amend, modify, or rescind, and it becomes then the final word. All of this is fine in theory. Practice, there are two problems that are happening. One is a perversity, namely, it is only regulation that needs to be placed before Parliament. I don't use the word regulation. I start using the word direction. I start using the word circular. And many of us have written about it in public. You can do an entire regulation of an important activity like NBFC or mutual funds without using the word regulation and completely bypassing parliamentary scrutiny. And I think that's a cause of concern. But the answer to that is Parliament scrutinizing that and saying, hello, regulator, this was meant to be a regulation. This can't be a direction. So please go back to the drawing board and redo it. But the sad truth is, to my knowledge, no standing committee has looked at any administrative law of regulation and actually written a report on, is it within the parliamentary legislation? Does it address the problem it seeks to address? And is it proportionate? Or is it, as agencies would all do, creeping of regulatory landscape and aggrandizement of the regulator at the expense of the regulated entity? So parliamentary scrutiny clearly needs to be strengthened. How will we do it? It's a much larger question. All I can say is the questioner is right. Parliamentary oversight needs to be strengthened. I'll hand it over to Sahu on challenges of regulation, and then we'll come back to social sector.
Yeah, the challenges, I gave you the example of route to Mithal Court. So that is the acceptability by the stakeholders or society that regulator is a legitimate key in this area, and we must deal with respect. But it's a two-way traffic. It's not that if a regulator does not behave well, it should not get expect also that kind of the organizations like the central banks all over the world, they have taken probably centuries to get that kind of credibility and legitimacy. So regulators in India will take that kind of time, but they have to make a beginning. So it's a two-way process. Regulators have to behave well for people to accept, and people also must accept, not get some regulator passes an order, you go and make an advertisement in newspaper condemning the regulator's conduct. But quite a few concerns are there. What happens is there is always a tension between the regulator, regulated, and the government. In the sense, quite often the regulator says that I want independence. Again, like the economic independence related to economic growth. Similarly, the output also studies show that the performance of regulator would be better if it has independence. But that independence is actually misunderstood quite a lot. The real independence quite often misunderstood in the sense, first is you want independence of what? But that boils down to they do not want independence of the legislature. They are happy with the once in 5 years scrutiny of subordinate legislations. That's fine. They do not want independence from judiciary because one order of higher, because there's a tribunal and it ultimately goes to Supreme Court. In case of SEBI, it is a little more, but for many regulators, even one matter does not reach Supreme Court. So regulators are happy with that kind, so our independence is not affected. That's a perfectly fine. But they become unhappy on the where they have some relation with the executive wing of the government. And those are not the matters executive is interested. Executive is not interested in what is your quality of a regulation or what is your quality of a disciplinary committee order. So they get into something which is not really relevant for the independence, and that is blown out of the proposal. And the real independence actually comes, again, many people argue that you need financial independence to do that. Yes, you need, but I don't think that is the sole thing that can matter exclusively. But what really gives independence on which people do not work is that the quality of people you have. I think some economist, I think Stigler probably, he told that these are the regulations are acquired by the regulated. That is a kind of a regulatory capture. So that is the biggest way to lose independence, and we lose independence because we do not have a capacity to understand what regulated is saying. So actually the real challenge is the capacity which we discussed earlier. Getting the right capacity, right motivation is important. Simultaneously, the challenge is also no one wants to be accountable. There is not accountability arrangement in the law as much, and regulators do not volunteer themselves to be accountable. Actually, if you volunteer to be accountable, like I told that, why not you promote an index which measures your performance? If you promote that, people will use that to measure yours. it's a two-way. Either the society or the stakeholders, they should find out a way to hold me accountable. If they are not doing it, I should volunteer, okay, these are the things we should look at. But instead of doing that, we are going to non-professional evaluation and mudslinging or newspaper reporting, but we don't come to a professional work.
I'll just add to this because it's linked to the social sector question. There was a follow-up, and we may not have time because we've already hit 7 o'clock, about does parliamentary oversight have the potential to hamper independence of a regulator and the relationship? So that's a follow-up to this. So if we have time, maybe we can take a few minutes of it. But to add to Rajni's question, here there's a question from Sonia Singh, who's at TIS, at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, in the Regulatory Policy and Governance course. She's asking, what are the other sectors that are crucial for the economy where the need of regulatory bodies is felt? After the pandemic, hearing the challenges in the health sector, addressing information asymmetry and other issues in health has become crucial. So do we need a separate body for regulation in this sector? So that's, again, it's health and education, it's linked to the social sector, they're related. But thinking of them as sectors of the economy, which they also are, so I think we'll end with that. If we have time, we can take the parliament.
Clearly, as a sector where there is much greater participation by the private sector, and sectors that are riddled with information asymmetry and a whole bunch of, the 4 standard reasons of market failure, Dr. Sahu alluded to it. All of these, if they are present, if any of them is present, there is a case for regulation. So if the state is not the provider and there is a lot of private sector provision, whether it's health or education, and those sectors have standard reasons of market failure, either concentration of economic power, or there is information asymmetry, etc., etc. There is clearly a case for regulation. And these sectors also have some of the features that we spoke about in the case of financial markets. They are now dynamic, because these are sectors where Parliament cannot write a complete legislation, because you can't envisage all situations a priori, and therefore you have to give some leeway to an agency to look at current reality, be able to come up with a solution to handle that reality, and if that reality changes, periodically update, rewrite. So therefore, I think the case for regulation in the social sector, where there is increasing provision by the private sector, possibilities of monopoly, possibilities of consumer protection issues, because you would ordinarily not associate education with consumer protection. But if a consumer in education is now paying 15 lakhs, 20 lakhs for education, and there is possibility of consumer protection issues coming up in that sector, you do need regulators. And it's not that we've not had regulators in these sectors. We've had All India Council of Technical Education. We've had bodies in the education sector. We've not, in the olden days, called them regulators, but effectively, they are doing what we today call regulation. The new body which is being thought of in the education sector, and the new Medical Commission of India, the regulator that has come up in the skills sector, are all examples. And health will clearly need a regulator with increasing provision by the private sector. So on the social sector, that will be my answer. And the parliament related question, I think, is very relevant. There are a number of instances where Parliament, rather than get into oversight of the legislative function of the regulator, typically individual committees of Parliament have got into individual orders of regulators. Now, there is a problem there, because you cannot prevent a Parliament member from asking, say, a question or raising an issue on an individual order. So in that sense, I think we need to talk about know your regulator much more widely, because I think some of this is coming from inadequate appreciation of roles. So for the individual order by the regulator, there is a recourse in the form of going to the tribunal or going to the judicial hierarchy. But for the more systemic orders or regulations of the regulator, Parliament is the recourse. And I think there is need to educate a whole set of stakeholders on the implications of this new form of organization of government and respective roles assigned to various supervisory bodies, other stakeholders. Anything that Sahu would like to
really
add?
to supplement, not much to supplement, but see, we must realize that regulator and government have a principal agent relationship. And in, I think, Giladi probably, the regulators are the fifth layer in the chain of, in the hierarchy. So I don't see any way to say that if the parliament supervises my work, my independence is compromised. I am a delegate and agent, I am working for you. And what does parliament do? Parliament says that whether your laws are right. Parliament is not coming and saying that why you are doing this enforcement or passing an order against this. So is not parliament equipped to say what is a good law for the country? So I don't think a parliamentary scrutiny anyway is a compromise of a regulator's independence, rather actually strengthens. But again, in a democratic setup, you cannot have any agency who is independent. That's why in the beginning I told you, independent of what? You can never be independent of the law, the standard checks and balances. The state has a mechanism of legislature, executive, judiciary. So one exercises vigilance over the other. In fact, the harmonious existence of all these things is a plus point. It gives strength rather than a weakness. Otherwise, the regulator used to go astray and move away from the very purpose for which it was set up. Actually, it is welcome to have some kind of scrutiny from parliament. It should be structured scrutiny and regular interval. So I don't see any kind of compromise on the independence because of parliamentary scrutiny.
In some ways, you're also pointing to the other challenge, which is regulatory. I mean, we're talking about regulatory capacity, but legislative capacity. Parliamentary capacity is also critical. We've been looking at the function of committees. They function relatively well. Are they not being utilized as well? Or the conversation gets dominated by parliament sessions and whether they are disrupted or not. But there's many other kinds of work and forms of scrutiny that we also have to understand, and that's critically related to regulation and regulatory life. I mean, it's been a really rich and wonderful conversation. I think we've covered so much ground. We're a little past the time. And it's been wonderful to have participation from the audience, both on Zoom and on Facebook Live. So thank you so much to all of you for attending. We will, because this is a series, we will be recording all of these sessions. We'll put them on a website so that people who have not been able to attend everything will actually be able to catch up on the whole series and its development. We hope, in addition to having structured conversations with regulators each month, at a certain point, we'll pull together another cross-cutting panel, maybe with multiple regulators and some academics, to look at some of the emerging themes that are coming up and challenges that are coming up. But to thank you all so much. It's been such a rich and interesting and exciting conversation. And I think, Dr. Krishnan, you mentioned FSSAI and how it touches all of our lives. The next, and we're very delighted that the first full-length conversation will be with Rita Teotia, who is the head of
chairperson
of FSSAI. And it'll be on the 21st of October. So it'll be really wonderful to have all of you and more join us. Please do tell your colleagues and your friends and your classmates about the initiative. It really is about getting the public involved and engaged. And I think you mentioned that academies and others. So I think hopefully we'll have a diverse group of stakeholders who join us in this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikla, and thank you, Dr. Sahu. And thanks to the audience, and look forward to re-engaging with you on the 21st of October. Thank you.
Thank you so much.